Welcome to the If I Had More Time podcast at Mariners Church. This podcast series invites you into a casual conversation with our senior pastor, Eric Geiger, and our teaching team to hear a few helpful insights and truths they wish they had time to include in the weekend message. Be sure that you have listened to this weekend's message prior to listening to the podcast so you get the most out of our current series. We hope you enjoy it. Thank you guys so much for joining us for the If I Had More Time podcast. We are in week 3 of our series, What Would Jesus Say? Answering the question, what would Jesus say to a greedy business leader? I have John Thomas here, our Irvine discipleship pastor, and Eric Geiger, our senior pastor, of course. Before we jump into any of the sermon content, this was sermon content, excuse me, but it's of utmost importance matter to me. You talked about the pilots that you prefer whenever you're flying, yes. Eric. And I have just shared with Eric and John, and I am so curious if others out there know about this, the latest TikTok fad, which I believe would educate all of you.
I don't know about the latest. I know about zero TikTok fads. So great to see.
That's a pretty big title. Latest fad. So this has gone super viral.
It went viral, but maybe I'm just in a weird corner of TikTok right now.
You've gone down some algorithm.
Exactly. It heard all of my conversations about flights or things, but I've had some really helpful pilots explain turbulence to me using Jell-O.
Okay.
But I'm not sure it's going to work over this podcast, but I felt the need to educate you, Eric, make sure you know. I think you're as safe as a little jelly bean in Jell-O would be.
So they're saying that the plane is a jelly bean.
Yes.
And that the turbulence is Jell-O. And I'm inside.
You are the jelly bean. The plane is the jelly bean
Okay.
inside of the Jell-O. And if you shake the cup of Jell-O, that jelly bean doesn't move.
Okay, so whoever came up with that TikTok video, I appreciate the attempt to make people like me feel better about turbulence.
It's true. It's all just to put you at ease.
So I'm thankful for the attempt. It's a bad illustration because it's not true.
Here we go.
I do move when I'm on a plane. You can even see the altitude change when you're watching the screen in front of you. Like you move. Turbulence, that is a bad illustration because I'm moving. I am moving.
Have you seen the videos of people like fly?
Yes.
I'm officially tapped out of my expertise at this point. It doesn't go very far.
But well done on the attempt.
Yes, it brought me peace. I was hoping I could bring you some. Okay. I'm so sorry.
Jell-O liquefies, so then what do you do?
Then that's a problem. You're in trouble.
Okay, I don't.
Oh, it was a great weekend at all of our congregations, and I'm really grateful for the series so far. Having a lot of fun, and my life group's enjoying great conversations too this week, talking about the story of Zacchaeus.
Yep.
It was so fun. And
if you grew up in church like old school, we were tempted. JT's got his hand.
I'm not going to do it. I'm ready though, but I'm not going to do it.
But I didn't, because we have so many people in our church who this is their first church experience, so they wouldn't have grown up. But if you grew up as a little kid going to church, Vacation Bible School, you were taught a song about Zacchaeus. Mm-hmm. Zacchaeus was a wee little man, a wee little man was he. He climbed up on the sycamore tree
to see what he could see.
To see what he could see.
Yeah,
that's it.
There's flannel graph that accompanies it and everything. It's a whole thing.
And that's what we did not use the song, but for those who heard the song growing up, you can rejoice that you had parents who brought you to church and that you heard about Zacchaeus when you were 7 years old.
Yeah, that's right.
What did the song teach us about him, though?
You know for sure when you hear the word Zacchaeus, you are remembering that he's a tiny person that
right. That's all I know. He was a wee little
and
man.
really good at climbing trees.
He can really climb.
I just picture just like
really fast tree climber.
Great,
but
he talks about his hunger.
It probably would have been a more biblically accurate song if it was Zacchaeus was a greedy, wretched man,
a greedy business leader,
greedy business leader
to climb up to the tree to hear what Jesus would say to him.
Yeah,
that would have been it.
That would probably have been more theologically accurate.
Maybe.
Yeah, we'll do a whole series on that, reworking all of your favorite Sunday school memories.
That'd be great. Let's go.
Traumatize some people, ruin some memories. So tell us a little bit more about Zacchaeus. You know, you talked about him as the tax collector. I'm grateful for the clarification. You know, it's not like what we know today as your IRS agent.
Yeah.
We love those people and are grateful for what they do. But in this time, a tax collector, you explained that to our church really well. It was a very, very different than what we know now.
To sign up to be a tax collector, you were betraying your own people because you were working for Rome And then the way that Rome would secure your employment is you could steal from other people. So when you read through the Gospels, you see the phrase sinner and tax collector. So tax collectors were looked upon as the lowest possible people. Yeah. And these were people who were okay with that because they actually loved the money so much. They didn't care at all what you thought of them, right? Yeah. So, and Jesus not only goes and spends time with Zacchaeus, but one of his disciples, Matthew, was a tax collector. So Jesus chose unlikely people to be his own. One of his disciples was a tax collector. So Jesus pursued these people. Yeah. We sometimes think of, the down and out that Jesus pursues as, like, in a couple of weeks we'll talk about the sinful woman who anoints Jesus with oil. Most scholars would say she's a prostitute. Then you have the physically outcast. In that culture, if you had a sickness, the Jewish people at that point in history looked at you as if you had done some type of sin that would cause God to judge you with a sickness. So when Jesus heals the lepers, the paralyzed person that we talked about week 1, take up your mat and walk. So Jesus is spending time with the outcast of society. Tax collector, though, you could probably put even in a different category. It's why sinners and tax collectors, because unlike the sinful woman who perhaps had a past that she had been abandoned, likely, had no way to eat, was maybe doing this profession to live, to get by.
Right.
A tax collector, this was no longer about, I'm doing this just to live.
Did they live like lavishly?
Yeah, I mean,
these were very wealthy people.
The passage, he was very wealthy. So it is someone who repeatedly over and over again hurts other people, takes advantage of other people. So I don't think anyone looked at the tax collector with sympathy.
Yeah.
So you might look at the prostitute with sympathy, like, oh man, she's just hit rock bottom in her life and feels trapped, like there's nowhere else that she can go. You would look at the sick with that way, even if you had the philosophy that they had done something wrong. Yeah, you still would feel like, man, that must be so painful to be where they are. Nobody looked at the tax collector with sympathy,
right? Because he had something to fall back on, his wealth and his riches. The other despised, marginalized, nothing else. That's all that was there for him.
Right.
So not in any high regard.
Yeah.
A traitor, despised. I mean,
hated.
So this is a despised person who's in some ways viewed as the low of the low, but doesn't live like the low of the low.
Right. That's good.
Lives a high life.
Yeah. And yet Jesus still explicitly pursues him.
Goes after that person.
Yeah.
Oof. I wonder if there were people that had a hard time with that. Like
the passage says they complained.
The disciples.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the passage says they complained. I think some who would appreciate that Jesus healed the paralyzed would wrestle with him going to Zacchaeus' house.
Yeah.
Because of any of the people, Zacchaeus deserves it the least. Look at all the horrible things he's done.
Yeah. It was probably a similar group too that wanted Jesus to be the conqueror of Rome, right? Like based on all of the prophecies that he would come and would rule, they expected a very different king, Yeah.
So you mentioned the disciples, like Judas for sure would have hated this.
Totally.
Because Judas wanted Jesus to overthrow the Roman Empire. Judas hated, and others did too. Like when they would take the Passover, we took communion together this weekend, it would feel like, why are we doing this, remembering that we were set free from Egyptian slavery? We're slaves again, guys. Yeah. Rome is occupying our territory. This is so foolish. Why are we looking back hundreds of years? Let's do something about our current enemy. Yeah. Let's overthrow the Roman Empire that is in our land. This is ridiculous. And then Jesus goes and spends time with a person who's cuddled up to Rome, Zacchaeus. Yeah. So it's
part of the very system of the empire that they're being oppressed under that they thought Jesus was going to come to completely abolish.
Yeah.
And now Jesus is pursuing this person with love, grace, and compassion. That doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it doesn't. It reminds me of, I learned this very early on in my walk with Jesus. I was in college and I had spent a summer overseas, and heading back to school, I was in a sorority, and I was going through like a list of girls in a group chat, and I would pray for them by name. This is when I was super spiritual, very disciplined in my prayer life. But I remember getting to this, I would pray for each of them by name. I got to this one girl, and this girl was so wild, like the wildest girl in our sorority. And I remember praying for her, but really not even believing what I was praying for because she was so far away.
Felt so, like she's so far gone.
Yeah, totally. And the next year, this girl has a radical encounter with God.
Sweet.
That she walks down the hallway to my room and is like, can you tell me about, we have this awesome, she ends up being in my wedding. Like this girl,
That's really cool.
She ends up living overseas for a year, sharing the gospel with people. Like so that happened so early on in my walk with God that I'm reminded of it hearing the story of Zacchaeus, that the person that you're not even that you would never think of, the person that you would just think probably not, too far, cushioned by too many things of this world. There's no way God could get through to them. Like he didn't even use anybody in his encounter with my friend Allie. Like it was just the two of them.
I love that.
It's amazing, but I'm encouraged again reading this story, like whoever that person is in your life.
There's nobody too far gone. There's nobody too low, no one too high.
Not one.
Jesus wants to come into the house of Zacchaeus.
Yeah, and he did. And we saw a beautiful salvation story.
Yes.
And instantly saw fruit, which
right away.
is so amazing. Yeah. Like, what do I do with that,
The fast, clear indication of salvation.
Yeah, it's his generosity so quickly being fruit from what God had done for him.
And extreme generosity. I'll pay people back 4 times. I'll give away half my resources.
Yeah.
I mean, really.
It's immediate.
It's
stunning. Yeah. It's immediate. Go from extorting people and taking off the top and being despised and having an identity probably around that to, in an instant, in a conversation over dinner, everything changes. Not just about his state, but his actions. Everything changes. And sanctification is a process.
Yes.
But it seemed to happen rapidly in this case.
It's important when you read this scripture to know that sometimes you are reading description and sometimes you're reading prescription. Right. And this is a description of someone's sanctification. This one person, Zacchaeus, in terms of the speed and the extreme nature of it. I mean, I have several friends who give away half of their income, 50%, but it took them years to get there. Yeah. They started as a new Christian tithing, and then they said, I'm going to add 1% a year every time I get a raise. And then they had a couple big raises and they added 3%. And, it took them like 25, 30 years to get to 50%. Zacchaeus, day one after becoming a Christian, is given away half his income. So the speed of sanctification is really fast with him. Yeah. But you read that as description of one person's sanctification, not as prescription of everyone's sanctification happening at that speed. So when we say the word sanctification, we mean the process of becoming more like Christ or the process of becoming more holy. Now, here is what is prescribed in the scripture is if you have met Jesus, you will be sanctified.
Yeah.
Right.
You will become more and more holy. You will turn away from your sin. You will love righteousness more and more. And that will happen in an increasing degree in your life. But it happens at different speeds for different people, and it manifests itself in different ways at different times. Yeah. But if you have met Jesus, you will become more like him, or you haven't really met Jesus.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It was a picture for me, too, of generosity as worship. Like he encountered the living God. And it was almost as if his response was like an act of worship. And our generosity is worship, too.
100%. Yes.
Like it was like, what else do I know but to give everything I have to this, to give of myself and my praise, place value on this thing, It was a beautiful story that I'm grateful we're unpacking. What's the relationship between works and grace on this on
Yes.
this conversation.
Yep. You have to be careful you don't read the passage and see, oh, Zacchaeus was generous. That's why Jesus said salvation. Oh, you've been generous, Zacchaeus. You're going to pay people back 4 times. You're going to give away half your money.
Right.
Now salvation has come. Now, salvation has come. Therefore, Zacchaeus is becoming generous. So works is a result of your salvation. Works doesn't bring about your salvation.
Good. That's great. And I think it also doubles into a conversation about generosity too, right? So we also are generous not because we're trying to get something out of our generosity. We're generous because God was first generous to us. And it's not, we're giving without expectation of return. And God is incredible and he blesses us in all kinds of different ways. But it's the same that we don't give to get our salvation. We also don't give the resources that God has given us in order that we get something back in return from him in the immediate.
Yeah. I mean, 2 things that Zacchaeus doesn't do that is sadly common in our struggles.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we struggle to be generous because resources, they're very tangible. We want to hang on to them. We feel secure. We feel comfort with resources. Zacchaeus doesn't look for the bare minimum of his generosity. Yeah. So that's all. When people ask me questions about giving, sometimes the question beneath the question is, what's the least I can give to where everything's cool between me and God? Zacchaeus is not going for the bare minimum. And he's not asking at all any question about what's he get if he does it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's all because his heart has been melted with how generous Jesus was to him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's like in that moment, the money, the resources completely lost its power, its grip over him.
Yeah.
There was no need to ask that question anymore. That thing that he held so precious and so dear and was known for and built an identity around. It's like in a minute that you would say stronghold was totally broken over his heart. And it's like, man, this thing that I thought was the thing before, it's like almost repulsive to me.
Yeah.
And so please, like, take it.
Yeah.
Take it. I don't want it.
Money had him, but now he has money.
Totally.
So he has money, and he can give money away because he has money.
Yeah.
But money no longer has him.
Yeah, that's it. Mm-hmm.
It's beautiful. Yeah. I mean, that's in all of our stories in some way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like there was something that was gripping us that we were set free from.
And we still struggle. We still struggle with grips. But when we met Jesus, the final, the breaking of the ultimate power over that thing over us has happened because Jesus has liberated us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I love what you talked about, drawing the picture between Jericho, the city where this happened, and in the Old Testament story about the walls coming down, and just made me think about the walls that are still surrounding us around greed.
Yeah.
The walls that we construct, the ideas around generosity and greed in our own lives, the things that we would say, well, these are barriers for me for actually living these out. And some of those walls are self-built. Some of those walls are overcommitted of our resources or a scarcity mindset or feeling like we need to know what the result of our giving is gonna be. But what would you say to someone who's like, man, I want to be this kind of person, but I have these walls built around me. I need help to unpack what these things are and to tear these things down in my life.
The first is I'd be like, man, it's beautiful that you know you have walls.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because sadly, most of the time when we have struggles or addictions or besetting sins or strongholds, we don't even know.
Right.
You know, we are corroded and we don't realize it. And so when we realize that there's a wall in our life that needs to go down, that's actually God's grace to us to alert us that there's a wall that needs to go down. John Owen, I mean, he said, he got this from Romans chapter 8, and this is a strong statement, but it's really true. Be killing sin or sin will be killing you.
Mm-hmm.
So when you recognize that you have a wall of greed, attack that wall, blow up that wall.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because if you don't, it's not gonna satisfy, and it will only destroy you. So get aggressive. Get aggressive at tearing down the wall.
Yeah. I think too, I actually learned this from Roddy when we first got married and were beginning to talk about our finances together. He actually shared with me that he and his friends have a really transparent relationship about their money, and they share with one another about their, I'm sure with discretion to some extent. I should probably inquire more what he means by that. But it's all in the spirit of holding one another accountable, challenging one another, reminding one another. So, I don't want to say rooted is always your answer here, but it's kind of like,
come on,
man, getting into community and for all of these spiritual disciplines, it really is helpful.
Yeah.
Eric, I'm so grateful for the message that you shared, and specifically teaching on generosity. And my heart kind of aches for, and of course empathizes with, the pain that really is real for people whenever you talk about money in general. So we first acknowledge that this can be uncomfortable, and there's real stories that you have of, whether it's a mistake that you've made or something that somebody's taken from you. Money is just, there's a lot of things wrapped up for people. So on that note, what do you think are some other things that keep us from being generous?
If someone didn't start early in their life or even in their faith journey with giving, and they then have built all of these goals or long list of expenses or just a complex life when it comes to finances, to insert that new rhythm into your life is a jarring new rhythm. Like any new rhythm. You're basically trying to develop a new holy habit, a new discipline. It's a discipline. It's a spiritual discipline. You are disadvantaging yourself. You are choosing to live on less so that you can be generous. So it's countercultural from a world that says indulge on yourself. So the only way you pull it off is if, the same with Zacchaeus, if salvation has come to this house, that motivates you to give, just because your heart is so overwhelmed with what God's done for you. It is and it's one of the reasons Kenton, my predecessor, he's said if Jesus lived in Orange County, he would teach on giving all of the time, because, and not just Orange County, Southern California, because material possessions are constantly presented as the way that people can have life.
Right.
And Jesus knows that's not the way, and the way that you fight it is with giving. The way you fight greed is with generosity. And so if Jesus lived here, he would talk about this all the time, because those things don't quench, they don't satisfy. But that is the reason why it's difficult, because we are constantly surrounded. Now, people give, but even non-Christians, but in a way that is good for them. Giving is good for you. But that's different than, I'm going to have a holy rhythm of generosity, even when it's not, my name's getting on a plaque, or I'm getting recognized at this thing or whatever. I'm giving because my heart's been overwhelmed.
Right. Where it's not just for the benefit of others or accolades, but it's because it's the transformation of grace in my life that I'm going to do that. I think also too, affluence is the water that we swim in Southern California. But I think there are many that would say, but that's not me. I see the comparison, everything that's around. I don't think I actually have enough. People might read a verse like 1 Timothy 6, where it's command those that are rich into this world not to be arrogant. And it's somebody should tell them, because there's a lot of affluence out here, and
but that ain't me.
But that's not me. So God knows my heart. He knows my checkbook, he knows my heart, and he knows it might be unwise for me to be a generous person right now, because, I don't have enough for myself. There's a scarcity mindset. I do think that that's a real barrier. One of the walls that we talk about why people don't enter into generosity. It's
because I have to cling to this because I don't have much.
Yeah. I think that's true for lots of different stages.
As opposed to, I have a God who owns everything.
Yeah.
And if I obey him, he's never going to let me.
Right.
He's not going to let me hunger. He's not.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's right. And it's easy to look at the affluence around and think, okay, well, that's not, other people have got it. Other people are going to help to fuel it.
Right.
And
right. I think it's true.
It's maybe not wise for me right now.
Yeah.
What would you say to help break down that wall?
Oh man,
So many things.
It's one, I would appreciate the person's desire to be wise.
Yeah.
But then I would say it's always wise.
Yeah. Yeah.
To be generous to God's kingdom.
Yeah.
You know, it's always wise to put Him first.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we are not.
Mm-hmm.
You grew up in you kind of make fun of yourself sometimes in the prosperity kind of background at times.
Yeah, that was a part of it for a season there. Yeah.
Yeah, where it would be like, hey, if you give, God's gonna,
guarantee just a blessing, a return.
Right.
Like it's almost as if, and this is characterizing it a little bit, it's almost as if you give, that God owes you something in return.
Yeah, that the extreme nature of it, not everyone is this way, but the extreme nature of it would be you actually put God into your service, into your debt by giving. So that obviously we're not teaching that, because we're teaching, no, we give because He's already been generous to us, not that we're trying to get Him to be generous to us. But at the same time, the reason that there are people who, I do think they're misapplying verses, but the reason that people get to that place is because there is scripture, such as in Malachi, where He says, test me. Mm-hmm. It's the only time in any of the commands where He says, hey, test me in this. Give and just see what I'll do. I'll open the doors of heaven, and the storehouse will be filled. Mm-hmm. And so I would say to the person who is, hey, just not right now. Now's not the season for me to give. Mm-hmm. I would say it's always wise to give, and the passage actually teaches you can. I mean, the verse says, if it wasn't in the Bible, I wouldn't believe it, because there's other verses that say, don't put your Lord God to the test. But there is a verse in the Bible where God says, test me. That's right. Test me with this. And it's actually Malachi 3 about the tithe. Test me and see if I won't open the doors of heaven, and you will be well taken care of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Eric, you mentioned some of those scriptures that we put on the app this weekend for everybody on the tithe. Would you mind sharing a couple of those with everybody? Yeah.
So on the app, you'll see. I mentioned the Malachi 3 passage. Here it is. This is Old Testament. So, I mean, the vast majority of theologians and scholars believe the tithe, and the tithe is 10%. So when someone says, I'm going to tithe this, I'm going to do a tithe, and what they mean is they're going to give. Mm-hmm. It's not a tithe unless it's 10%. It may be a third. I mean, not a tenth, but an eighth or a sixth. But a tithe is 10%. And Malachi 3:8-10, will a man rob God? Yet you are robbing me. How do we rob you, you ask? By not making the payments of the tenth and the contributions. You are suffering under a curse, and you're robbing me. Bring the full tenth into the storehouse, so that there may be food in my house. Test me in this, says the Lord of armies. See if I will not open the floodgates of heaven and pour out a blessing for you without measure. Mm-hmm. So, I think I interrupted myself a moment ago. What scholars say is that the tithe for sure is in the Old Testament. The debate is it in the New Testament? And after Jesus comes, is the tithe still applicable today? And I'll share a couple of passages. So Matthew chapter 23, verse 23, Jesus is rebuking the Pharisees. He says, "What do you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites? You pay a tithe, mint and dill and cumin, and yet you've neglected the more important matters, law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. These things should have been done without neglecting the others." Mm-hmm. So he rebukes them for only tithing, but then he says, but don't neglect the tithe. So Jesus actually affirms the tithe in Matthew 23. And then the passage that I lean on a good bit, it's actually a passage that we use when we encourage people to give through the Mariners app or to give online, because I really believe it's not just this modern cool technology. It's actually a really good way to obey this passage, which is 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2. Now about the collection for the saints, do the same as I instructed the Galatian churches. So he's writing the Corinthians, but he says, I told the Galatians the same thing. So this is not just one church. This is what Paul's telling a bunch of churches. On the first day of the week, each of you is to set something aside and save it in keeping with one's income, so that no collection will need to be made when I come. So first day of the week, regular, in keeping with one's income, proportionate. And so some scholars say, well, what's regular and proportionate? The tithe. That's 10%. So some scholars say the tithe still exists now. Others say, no, it's more, because every command in the Old Testament is repeated with greater expectation than the New Testament. So Old Testament, don't commit murder. New Testament, you hate your brother, you already committed murder. Old Testament, do not commit adultery. New Testament, you look at a woman lustfully, you've already committed adultery. So Old Testament, tithe. New Testament, generosity, but it's not less than the tithe. There's no way it's less than the tithe. So if the tithe is there, you see the principle in the New Testament, you could say it's the tithe. If it's not the tithe, it's not less than the tithe. It's not less than the tithe. Yeah. Right. Anyway.
Yeah.
I have not preached with like that angst that I just came off with just now. I have not preached with this holy frustration about it, because I believe the best way to pull generosity out of people for their own good isn't to rail on their will, isn't to logically tear apart an argument. Yeah. It's for their heart to be overwhelmed with the grace of Jesus.
Right.
That's right.
And if your heart is overwhelmed with the grace of Jesus, you will be a generous person. But intellectually, I can have the conversation about the tithe, and then in my own life and my own marriage, I'm really grateful that we've tithed and that we tithe.
Yeah. I always find it helpful to think about, if I have to let go of something like my money, like I've got my money, whatever that means, and what God has given me, what do I get to take hold of? What's on the other side of this? Because it's true, we do receive so much from this spiritual act of being generous. God does give us so much, not necessarily money in return, but what does await us when we're generous?
Yeah, I do know that He has taken care of me financially in beautiful ways by us we've been faithful in the tithe for a long season, for almost 3 decades. But more than that, it's the peace that transcends all human understanding. It's the joy. It's the satisfaction of knowing I'm participating in His work and His kingdom, that I'm joining Him in what He's doing.
Yeah.
So I'm grateful I don't live in the Old Testament times when my offering would be just burnt up. I'm grateful that it actually
that had to take faith, man.
Massive.
There it is.
Oh my goodness.
And yet it also shows that God was asking just for the hearts of the people.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah, but it's so true. We don't live in the constraint of the tithe anymore. If Christ has come to fulfill but not abolish it, then certainly we're liberated from the restrictions of the Old Testament law, and we're liberated from the restrictions of the law around tithing, that we're brought into the liberty then of like all that we have belongs to Him. I heard somebody say, tithing it's not the ceiling, it's meant to be really the floor.
I agree 100% with that.
Yeah.
It should be the starting point. Now, someone is head over heels in debt. They're new to the Christian faith. They're like, oh my gosh, I want to be Zacchaeus, but I've got this payment, this payment, this payment. You need to be a responsible person. I would find a starting place in your generosity journey and find something that you can turn down.
Yeah.
You can have less of what, so that you can start being generous, and then watch what God does. I mean, he is going to do an amazing work when you take a step in generosity. He is.
It's beautiful. Well, what a great weekend. Thank you so much, Eric, for the encouraging word. Thanks for joining us today on the If I Had More Time podcast, hosted by Mariners Church. We hope to see you next weekend at any of our congregations across Southern California or online. To view our service times at each congregation, be sure to check out our website at marinerschurch.org.